I'm Glenn Cohen. I'm the James A. Attwood and Leslie Williams Professor of Law, the Deputy Dean of Harvard Law School, and also the Faculty Director of the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics.
Great. It's wonderful to chat with you. So we're going to talk about psychedelics and a lot of the current concerns there are in terms of psychedelics and patenting and everything that'll happen in drug development in the future. So I was wondering if you could start by talking to us about some of the challenges related to informed consent for the use of psychedelics in the clinic.
Yeah, so the therapeutic use of psychedelics in a medical kind of official way is a relatively new phenomenon. We have one company that has sought FDA approval for MDMA, primarily for PTSD. We've got another that will likely soon seek approval for psilocybin, that's mushrooms, for use in major depressive disorder and perhaps other kinds of disorders. And one of the questions we're looking ahead to is to say, if one of these drugs is approved for use in a medical context, what should be the required elements of informed consent and what are the particular challenges of informed consent in this context? We wrote a paper on this, but I'll just mention a couple. One has to do with expectation and expectancy effects. So more than many other kinds of drugs, psychedelics, we have an issue with what's called set and setting. The idea that your expectation and the place in which you take a psychedelic drug may have an effect on what the experience is, such that the informed consent might itself prime you in terms of what to expect. So that's one issue. A different issue has to do with the fact that we've had sexual abuse and misconduct in some of the psychedelic trials we've seen before, and the idea that patients are in a highly suggestible state, but that touching is a major part of the way some people administer psychedelic-assisted therapy, and the question about how you regulate that ahead of time when somebody is in one of these kinds of settings, and that's a very complicated issue. A third big issue that sometimes is flagged is the question of psychedelics as transformative experience. So when I tell you, hey, we're going to administer this drug or you're undergoing a surgery, it's relatively easy to wrap your head about what that might be like and what to expect in terms of risks, in terms of benefits. There's an argument out there that taking psychedelics is much more like having a baby deciding to become pregnant, where you are becoming this other kind of entity, you are transforming, such that it's very hard to communicate to individuals what it is that this experience is going to be like, and the fact that the experience might change them. I think sometimes that argument is a little bit overstated, but that's an additional question about how to communicate that kind of information to patients. And finally, I'll say that some of these patients are patients that are in somewhat vulnerable circumstances, and we can talk about vulnerable populations in particular, and that brings its own challenges to how to communicate this kind of information in a way that is ethical and efficacious.
So kind of building off of vulnerable populations, how might the commercialization and patenting of psychedelics, when that happens, or how it does happen, impact access to these therapies for certain sociodemographic groups and other populations?
So one of the key drivers politically at the moment, and I think in the public eye, for larger integration of psychedelics into psychotherapy actually has been the veterans community in particular. It's been interesting politically in that I think when people think about psychedelics, that's not the first thing that jumps to mind, but it's in part because there are so few good treatment options for PTSD. This has been a vocal community that has expressed interest. But we also have lots of other populations for whom this therapy, if it's proven to be safe and efficacious, might be highly desirable. The tricky thing is, how do you administer it and combine it with psychotherapy in a way that is safe and efficacious, that produces good results, but make it available to people such that they can afford it? And this is a big question for the regulators, but also for the companies, and it relates in part to patenting. When you make something under intellectual property, when you treat it as patentable subject matter, it's kind of a deal whereby the company discloses information about it, shares lots of information that helps other inventors and helps the public, but gets an exclusivity over it for a period of time. It's a similar system with FDA approval, we call Hatch-Waxman or FDA exclusivity. But essentially, when you have exclusivity, as we see with other pharmaceuticals, you're able to charge a premium price. We know the price is much higher in the years when there's exclusivity than when a generic comes along and can offer it at a lower price. So one set of questions is how to think about the patentability of various kinds of psychedelics and in particular, those that have a long history of usage, for example, in indigenous populations, or are really naturally occurring substances. Should they be patentable? What parts of this should be patentable? Should you be able to assert intellectual property and protection over the way it integrates with psychotherapy, for example? And how do we think about how that's going to contribute to the costs involved? Because if you get a great therapy that's actually helping a lot of people, but then it's priced in a way that most people can't access it, that's a real lost opportunity, both for the world and for ethics.
Yeah. So the FDA recently had a contentious advisory opinion meeting about using MDA-assisted therapy for PTSD. So sort of what did you make of that hearing, and what do you have to add?
So the FDA recently had its first advisory committee hearing on the first of these psychedelics to seek approval by the FDA. It was the usage of MDMA, street drug often called ecstasy or Molly, a version of that to be used as psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD. And we'll know for sure what FDA is going to decide probably August 11th, I think might be the date, early August at least of this year of 2024. But it was a very contentious hearing. And among the things that I think were the most interesting from the hearing, I think people expected a lot of skepticism and a lot of pushing on hard questions, because that's what these advisory committees are supposed to do, is they make a recommendation to the FDA. The advisory committee ultimately recommended that FDA not approve the drug currently. But among the things that came up, one of the most interesting is the issue called functional unblinding. And here, when you think about running a clinical trial, you typically have a control arm and you have an active treatment arm. And ideally, if you can do it, you like your control arm to have a placebo, so somebody doesn't know that they're not getting the drug. And the reason is because people bring in all sorts of expectations into the trial. And if people think they're getting the drug or they know they're not, that might change their experience and their behavior. And that's particularly, I think, pertinent when it comes to a drug for mental health context. Well, here's the problem. As anybody who's read or even experienced a psychedelic before knows, it's fairly easy to know whether you've gotten a psychedelic as opposed to even a placebo that might activate, like niacin, cause you to be flushed or something like that. So there was a major concern with the data the company was showing, how to interpret it in light of this functional unblinding and the reality that the average participant probably knew which of the two states they were in, but also questions about whether the psychotherapist knew they were on the drug, on the MDMA, or not. There were other questions that were raised. So again, there were issues relating to past sexual misconduct in some of these trials and how it was investigated and what plans there were to control it. Questions about whether we need to have two licensed psychotherapists in the room at all times when this administration is going on, which has implications for cost. Questions about staying overnight. Questions about whether the trials were adequately diverse, in particular in terms of racial diversity. And then also questions about how long-term and how durable the effects were, as well as whether there was measurement of what FDA considers to be an adverse event, which is feelings of euphoria from taking MDMA, with the concern this might be relevant to abuse and the possibility of abuse of the drug going forward. You know, I think the company had a relatively rough ride with FDA. It was a company that was originally sort of a not-profit and not really a drug company mold that has become a for-profit company towards the end of its life before going before FDA after a very long period of back and forth with the agency. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I do think that it kind of, it certainly rattled many people who were hoping and expecting this might be available, in particular for veterans populations in the near future. But it's really important to take into account the fact that there might be safety risks, and in particular that we have good evidence that is effective. In particular, with FDA approval of a drug, it's very common for either right away or over time, drugs to be used for other disorders, for example, once FDA has approved it for one disorder. So that's an additional wrinkle to make sure we're extra careful and extra sure about this. I'll say one more thing and then I'll subside, which is to say, part of what I think is very complicated about this particular trial design, this particular drug, this particular context, is that the makers of this, Lykos, who's putting this forward, really expects this to be used with psychotherapy And yet FDA's attitude is we never regulate psychotherapy. That doesn't fall within our jurisdiction. We look at the drug itself. But I think this case study puts pressure on the idea that FDA could just review the drug without also looking very carefully about the psychotherapy and how the psychotherapy is delivered.
That's interesting. I'm sure there's very little precedent, to be honest, in a lot of other drug development.
Very true. I often tell people that there's at least 3 models of the way in which psychedelics are integrated into society at the moment or might in the near future. One is what I would call the medical model. This would be FDA approval. This would be the idea of prescribing psilocybin, mushrooms, or MDMA to a patient, combined with a licensed psychotherapist. We have licensed healthcare providers involved. We have a drug company potentially involved, and that's the model. The second model is religious use. People are often surprised to know that there are churches in the United States that actually have an exemption from the DEA to actually incorporate psychedelics, most commonly ayahuasca, into religious worship. They're few and far between. It doesn't happen all that often, but we do have individuals who use this as part of a legally protected religious exercise. The third pathway is a little harder to name. It's some combination of usage, not because I have a diagnosis, not because I have PTSD or MDD, not because it's part of my religious worship, but because it's for something else. Maybe it's for enlightenment more generally. Maybe it's for somewhat recreational experience. Maybe it's actually to connect with somebody I love, right? It's part of kind of a romantic experience, trying to rekindle our marriage and the like. This bucket is a little bit hard to characterize from a legal perspective. And one model we've seen rolled out, in particular first in Oregon and now in Colorado and perhaps elsewhere, has been what's sometimes called a facilitator model. So the person who will be involved will be licensed, but licensed as a psychedelic facilitator, not licensed as a physician or a nurse, or not practicing under that license as a physician or a nurse or another healthcare worker. The idea is, can we create a regulated pathway for people who want to help others with psychedelics, but they can't make medical claims and they can't be claiming to cure a disease or treat a disease. And so the goal would be for these states, and these are states that have tried to do this in the shadow of the fact that these psychedelics are still Schedule I drugs, which means the federal government regulates them and really criminalizes them to a large extent, some usages of them. They've tried to carve out a space for this non-medical, non-religious, but still in some deep way helpful to people or producing well-being or connection for people. And one of the most interesting questions is, this thus far has happened before there has been FDA approval. If and when FDA approves one of these psychedelics, will that model continue to exist? Also, many people, including me, believe that if FDA approves one of the psychedelics, it will cause a rescheduling of the drug that has been approved to a lower drug schedule, because Schedule I is really for things that have no medical value, no medical use, no commonly accepted medical use at all. And certainly FDA approval would change that, and I think would prompt a rescheduling.
Sure, also a lot more competition down the line as well in drug companies. So you touched on this a little bit earlier when you mentioned veterans and veteran populations, but are there special populations for whom the use of psychedelics in clinical medicine raises especially special concerns?
So I've been talking for the most part about the general population use, people who want to use psychedelics, but there might be, especially in the medical usage, some populations we have to think more carefully about. One that my team has written, my team is the team that's part of the POP Law, the program on psychedelic law and regulation. So in particular, Mason Marks, Susanna Baruch, some other folks who we've worked with over the years. We've talked about end-of-life populations. So in fact, some of the early modern studies on using psychedelics in the medical context were actually with patients facing end-of-life care, often cancer patients, for example. And in this population, there are a series of, I think, interesting kind of nuances. One is, if somebody has a bad experience and it's really close to the end of their life, maybe that feels quite different than somebody having a bad experience much earlier in their life in terms of the way their life ends. And maybe that is something that we have to kind of sensitize to about informed consent. Another piece of this, I think, has to do with caregivers and family members, right? Who it is who might be an appropriate person to administer this. So folks who deal in palliative care, while they have lots of familiarity with lots of drugs, psychedelics is not particularly part of that competency. So how do we think about that? Then there are concerns with the fact that this is often a vulnerable population in terms of cognition and declining cognition for some folks, especially at their end of life because of age conditions, right? They're getting older. We might be particularly worried about threats of coercion, threats of pressure, and the like. So these are things that we should think about. Then, and this is way ahead of the curve, we're not talking about this yet, but I think it is an interesting question to ask. While PTSD and MDD, major depressive disorder, are diagnoses that adults have, there also are adolescents, for example, and pediatric populations who have these diagnoses. Could we imagine many drugs are approved for an adult population but prescribed off-label to a pediatric population? Could we imagine a world where we have a child or an adolescent who's tried many therapies unsuccessfully, who is facing risks of suicidality, for example, self-harm, for whom a physician decides that actually this might be, and if parents and the adolescent or the child themselves all come together and think this is an appropriate thing to try? Does that strike us as something that should be in the realm of conversation, should be completely outside the conversation? And FDA, if it does approve one of these psychedelics, will set some of the terms of access through what's called a REMS, a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, where it'll specify how can these be administered, to whom can they be administered, and the like, how tightly they will supervise that administration. So that's a second other very interesting population. Lastly, I'll just say that in the clinical trials themselves, they have excluded many individuals with other psychiatric diagnoses from access to psychedelics. We might see some pressure on that, the question about whether it's appropriate to exclude post-approval those people from accessing it, and how tightly we're going to control access versus not. So people who have histories of psychosis in their family, for example, should they be given access if they want it, they understand the risks? So I think these are very interesting kind of frontiers that we're likely to face once we get past a point, or if we get past a point where one of these drugs are actually approved for use in more narrow populations. So there's also this question about how to treat traditional knowledge and indigenous traditions many of whom have used certain kinds of psychedelics for a long period of time. And in the cosmology of some of these communities, it's not thought of as a drug, it's thought about as something sacred, right? Something that's part of the community. There are also populations where actually only the shamanic figure takes it, rather than the people who are seeking to be helped. So there's very interesting questions here about biopiracy, about exploitation, about colonialism, but also about the appropriation of existing traditions, right? Who should have the say, who should get to decide, and how we ensure that actually these populations, if it is their sacred medicine, their sacred plant that's being used in this way, how they're given power towards governance, inclusion, but also benefit sharing in terms of the benefits that come. And I think that for the most part, the commercial entities have not been particularly focused on that. And if governments don't force them to be focused on that and don't intervene, we may never see that dialogue and that inclusion really happen.
Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.